Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first in a series of Maersk Trade Talks. My name is Graham Slack, and I'm the Chief Economist at AP Moller Maersk. I'm delighted to have with us today Professor Dani Rodrik to discuss and walk us through some thoughts on the future of trade. Over 20 years ago, Dani pointed out inherent tensions between hyperglobalization and the social contract, foreseeing the backlash against trade, against global trade that we see today. Today, Dani is calling for radical institutional change in order to secure the very future of the global trading system. Dani, welcome to the talk. Hi, Dani. Welcome to the talk this afternoon.
Hi. Nice to be with you.
Before we jump in, I just want to remind all of our viewers and listeners that during this conversation, you can ask your questions, make comments in the chat, and we'll try and weave them into the discussion and conversation as we go. So with that, Dani, let's jump straight in. And I think, as we were discussing just before this call, a lot of focus in the logistics industry and obviously for companies is on the current disruptions in supply chains. And really what's happened is that we've forgotten about all of the issues that global trade and challenges global trade was facing before the pandemic. Can you just set the scene for us a little bit and remind us, what was going on before the pandemic set in terms of the challenges that global trade was facing?
Yes, I think you're right, Graham, that obviously the pandemic has been such a major event that we're all focused on the immediate consequences. But in many ways, the pandemic simply exacerbates many fundamental changes that were already going on. And I think there were essentially economic, political, and technological changes that were already upsetting the kind of balance we had in the international economy. Economic in the sense that there was some natural saturation that was happening in the degree of trade orientation of some major economies. For example, China already had begun to significantly reduce its trade orientation, with its export to GDP falling significantly since the global financial crisis. So that's already been ongoing. Politically, there were changes in terms of course, the backlash to trade with some deep causes that was sort of brewing under the radar screen. We can talk about that. But there were also sort of, secular technological changes that with shifts towards more skill and capital intensive technologies, the shift in demand towards services, which are generally less tradable than goods, that the global division of labor, which had sort of deepened and intensified over a number of decades, that was beginning to slow down, and that was naturally put a damper on the expansion of world trade. So I would say, sort of these are broad economic, political, and technological changes that were already driving us towards a much more sort of regionalized, not as buoyant world trading system compared to the period between the 1990s and the late 2010s.
Yeah. And to some extent, these were natural outcomes. They say the economics was shifting, comparative advantage was moving, and then the initial outwave of outsourcing and seeking sort of labor arbitrage was beginning to fade. So to some extent, natural and to be expected. But there were other things that were changing as well, I guess. I think you touched on them in terms of the policy space. I'm thinking in terms of WTO, in terms of rising disenfranchisement with trade. What was going on there? What's your read on what was happening underpinning that in terms of WTO and that rising disenfranchisement with trade itself?
Yes. I think it's important to realize that the kind of globalization regime that we embarked on after the 1990s was actually qualitatively quite different than the kind of globalization or international economy we had in the decades immediately after the Second World War. And I think, and that's why sort of I often call the period after the 1990s a period of hyperglobalization, to distinguish it from the Bretton Woods model of globalization, which I would say really lasted in its sort of general principles through the 1980s. But I think the main difference between what happened after the 1990s was that, we ended up, rather than thinking about the international economy and the global economy as being in the service of domestic employment and social and cohesiveness goals. In other words, the world economy supporting national economies, which was the general principle behind the creation of the Bretton Woods regime and the international economy after the Second World War. We reversed those priorities, and our domestic economic and social arrangements increasingly began to be viewed as being in the service of the global economy. So the whole narrative was, how do you compete best in the global economy? The right, the political right and the political left had different answers to that question. The left would emphasize investments in skill, education, infrastructure, and so forth. The right would emphasize deregulation, liberalization of markets, and cutting off red tape. But in both cases, it was so that we could compete better in the global economy. And I think the WTO was, with the creation in 1994, was the sort of the institutional embodiment of this change in principles. But of course, that was taken much further also with sort of, regional trade agreements and the proliferation of bilateral and regional trade agreements, which took this principle much, much further, and increasingly our domestic economic policy became sort of an adjunct to our desire to establish a ever more perfect, more frictionless global economy. I think, and therefore, I think there was a natural backlash to that. That the benefit, not everybody benefited from the system. Lots of people felt left out. And this reversal of priorities, I think, was pregnant with this backlash that one could have predicted just by looking at history, the earlier periods of globalization.
Yeah. Can you thanks, Danny. That's really insightful. You hit on a couple of things. I just maybe double click on. You mentioned the policy dilemmas, and I think you've written about this trilemma, or the globalization paradox, and the roots that has in some of your historical observations. And I think if you go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, you can see some of the similar phenomena that we're seeing today. Can you just speak to that a little bit, just to set that sort of historical context and this tension, this inherent tension you saw more than 20 years ago in hyperglobalization versus the nation state and other elements that you just mentioned?
So what I've called the political trilemma of the world economy really arises from a tension between what international traders, international investors, global financiers want on the one hand, and what political systems, which are largely constituted around nation states, want. So what traders and financiers want is a world in which they don't encounter costs of doing business across borders. In other words, they don't want national borders to erect transaction costs. Those could be, of course, tariffs or controls on the flow of capital. But more fundamentally today, there are really differences in regulations, that there are costs of doing business because every nation has different health and sanitary, environmental, tax rules. Those are all costs of doing business if you're a multinational company or if you're a financier. So if you're moving in the direction of hyperglobalization, you want to reduce those transactions costs to the extent possible. If you are a sort of a political system, which are sort of have to be responsive to their electorates, which are essentially national, political systems want to be different from other countries. So there's the tension arises from a desire of political systems to want to be different, from the desire of the international economy to want to be identical. And because different nations have different histories, they have different trajectories, they have different levels of development, therefore different needs, different trade-offs between, let's say, financial risk and financial stability, between health, and other economic concerns. So there's a natural tendency for different countries to want to erect, different types of regulations and fiscal regimes. But a completely hyper-globalized economy sort of wants to, basically even out those differences. And that's where the tension ultimately arises. And what we need to understand is that this is an inevitable tension, that neither can we have a frictionless world economy, nor what can we or should we have a world economy in which every nation is an island on itself, because that would mean giving up on the gains from trade. And therefore, we need to create a system that we are conscious that we have to, on the one hand, allow nations to have diversity, that different countries to have different tax regimes that are not undermined by, sort of race to the bottom on the part of corporations. Allow developing countries the space to have their industrial policies and development policies that are not constrained by international trade rules. While we're also enabling significant amount of trade and investment, because those are also very important. But we can't have both, and so we need to find kind of an intermediate solution. And that's really, I think, to my mind, that's where the Bretton Woods regime, I mean, the system that came out of the Second World War, was, I think, designed with those trade-offs explicitly in mind. And what happened was that that system was, in fact, so successful that we forgot that it was the result of a trade-off, very explicit trade-off between, allowing space for national policies and autonomy, and also creating space for expansion of long-term investment and trade. And we said it's all about trade and investment, and now let's go and maximize that, forgetting the other leg of this balance.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I think that was very insightful in this tension between the, if you will, the comparative advantage type argument of of efficiency versus the political efficacy and fairness and social inclusion dimension. When we think about then emerging markets in particular, move on to mature markets in a minute, and then the policy implications. But when we think about this from the perspective of emerging markets, many of which have been given policy advice on the basis of comparative advantage and this hyperglobalized system, what's the future for them in a world which is becoming, as you say, more protectionist, a bit more careful about how it approaches trade? What's the implication for emerging markets and their development model, which has in many cases been very export orientated? Do they need to change that approach? Do they need to adjust their domestic policies? How do you see them continue to integrate and create welfare for the systems?
So let me answer that in two parts. One is, we have to draw the right lessons, the trade strategies of successful countries. And the second is how the context is changing and what that implies for the future. Now, with regard to the first, there's always been two different traditions of thinking about the role of trade and comparative advantage for countries that are trying to catch up. One tradition is associated with people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, right? David Ricardo is the originator of the concept of comparative advantage, but it's really all about sort of, maximizing the gains from trade by allowing freer trade, specialization according to comparative advantage, and so forth. The second tradition is also venerable, but it's maybe sort of the leading thinker under that would be like Friedrich List, the German economic theorist, or actually before him, Alexander Hamilton in the US, which, in the late 18th century, the United States was in the position of an emerging market economy of today. And what Alexander Hamilton argued was that you couldn't let the forces of free trade and free markets guide your economy, because then you'd essentially be just simply an agrarian primary product exporting country, and therefore you needed to actually use the forces of government policy to actively diversify your economy, move into manufacturing, because otherwise, comparative advantage would condemn you to a future as a producer of primary products. Now, the countries that have very successfully navigated these two set of ideas are ones that, like the East Asian economies of after the Second World War, Japan and Korea, Taiwan, and ultimately, of course, China, which once again were sort of it took the best of both of those approaches. On the one hand, they used the world economy. On the other hand, they had very active policies domestically to diversify their economies, industrial policies, competitive exchange rates, controls on short-term capital flows, and so forth. So this was so the message is that you grow and you catch up and you develop by having a very sort of judicious combination of promoting integration into the world economy while making sure that the conditions, the domestic conditions for economic diversification and moving into manufacturing are present. And that means a lot of government policy. Now, how does that mean now for the future? I think there is, the general message still applies that I think the most successful economies are going to be sort of economies that are pursuing this mixed strategy of having a conscious domestic investment and diversification policy while they try to integrate into world economy. So being essentially a two-handed strategy. But on the qualified by the fact that the kind of global division of labor, which in the 60s, 70s, 80s through the 90s, that allowed low wage cost, low labor cost economies to specialize in simple manufactures. The strategy that South Korea, Taiwan, ultimately China followed, that strategy is essentially less and less an escalator for economic growth than it was in earlier decades. And this is due to changes that I've called premature deindustrialization, which is that primarily for reasons that are technological, that manufacturing is increasingly becoming skill and capital intensive, responding to relatively high labor costs in the advanced countries, because that's the new innovations are coming from those advanced countries, has the effect, these technological changes have the effect that developing countries whose primary comparative advantage is in low cost labor is essentially being eroded. So I actually do not see going forward today's low labor cost economies being able to replicate the kind of export and growth miracles that the East Asian economies have been able to do. That means that there will need to be adjustments along the margin. I think at the margin, you need to emphasize growing a domestic middle class, emphasize service employment in services a lot more than the East Asian economies had to do when they were catching up. But ultimately, in terms of the general balance between external orientation and domestic orientation, between forces of the market and government intervention, I think those general lessons still hold.
Yeah. It seems, Dani, just to pick up on this point around automation and technology. I mean, this is a key driving theme, and we'll pick up it up on in a minute when we get into mature markets and inequality. But just to pick on that theme now and in this context of emerging markets. And you mentioned domestic policies. Does this, I suppose, mean that domestic policy must be much more active in making sure the labor force is not just a low-cost labor force, but is actually an educated labor force able to absorb the technology and use it to gain jobs and to gain industries that can then re-export and provide for the domestic economy, or is there another path, a more market-orientated path that will lead us to the same outcome?
It's more education and more skills is always the right answer, except that it doesn't necessarily help, the labor force that you have at present.
Yeah.
And So I think that the idea that simply by investing more in training and more education and skilling up your existing labor force, that you will be able to, adapt to the, sort of this exogenous needs of these technological forces out there, I think is risky and unrealistic. Of course, every country should have the best education and vocational training and skill building, programs that it should have, because that's the foundation for the future. But it's if the jobs are not being created for the kind of labor you have, you won't remain a country for very long, until that future comes around. So
Yeah.
you need other strategies, and the question is what those strategies are. Now, again, traditionally, export-oriented manufacturing was the great solution to the conundrum, because you did not need huge amount of skills to turn, farmhands into, production workers in manufacturing. So you did not need to invest a whole lot in skill and education, and that could catch up later. And that's how, these East Asian economies were able to grow so rapidly. That now that is no longer true. I mean, in the low-income African countries that I look at, that have in other ways all the preconditions for manufacturing takeoffs, in a country like Ethiopia, for example, which is actually one of the more successful industrializers in sub-Saharan Africa. They're not creating jobs
Yeah.
for people, and so that's why I think increasingly those jobs will need to come from outside manufacturing, and that will require somewhat different strategies.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I just want to take a quick pause here to remind all the listeners that we are very much open to comments in the chat and questions. So please feel free. Dani, we have a very large audience here from around the world. I'm looking at from Colombia to Kenya to South Africa. So we have a very wide audience who are living and breathing what you are just speaking about. So please, any comments or questions, feel free to post them here in the chat. Dani, moving on to mature markets, I mean, we've seen, of course, the issues of inequality and redistribution coming to the fore, most prominent in the US, and a lot of commentators arguing that inequality is a result of globalization. Others suggesting that global trade is a part of the solution. We can already sort of detect from the way you're articulating yourself that you have a much more rounded view, and that you see points, I think, in both camps, both perspectives. Can you speak a bit to how you see that link between globalization, inequality, and the challenges and choices that mature markets are facing, and particularly, of course, most prominently is the US, given the policy choices they've been through in the previous administration. Can you speak a little bit to how you see that and as I said, the choices they face going forward?
I think the starting point of the discussion has to be that we have to acknowledge that globalization does have redistributive consequences within nations. That there are for the advanced nations, for example, skilled professionals, business owners, wealthy individuals. Owners of capital in general, have benefited a lot more than workers, and especially regions of countries that were left behind. And there is a very fundamental economic theorem in international trade, which says that, in fact, the consequences of globalization are not simply to exacerbate relative changes in income, but actually that there will be always some losers from trade. So that's baked into the theory of trade and comparative advantage, so that we should not be surprised that there was, during a period of intensification of globalization, that there would have been significant segments of losers, and not just in terms of relative incomes and the relative social status, but also actually absolute incomes, people who lost their jobs, people who had to move elsewhere and get a lower paid income. lot of communities which lost factories that were outsourced, where sort of there was a period of social decline, lots of health and other social problems arising, right? Rises in mortality, opioid addiction, and so forth. So these all have been documented. Now, uh, having said that, trade and globalization are not the only thing that causes these economic shocks and inequality. Certain technological change, everyday market changes, happen, that sort of, the bulk of, labor market dislocations is actually caused not by globalization, but just, ordinary course of business. But there's one respect in which globalization is different than sort of your ordinary, supply and demand shocks at home, or changes in technology, which is that globalization, often the shocks that are associated with globalization come with a sense that they're very unfair. So it's not just inequality, but a sense of unfairness of these shocks. So the simplest example of this is that, if you're in a community and then, your firm, you lose your job, your firm has to shut down because, another firm in the neighboring community, sort of invested more, they came up with a better product. Well, you sort of say, well, that's ordinary competition. But if you've lost your job, or your firm shuts down because, your employer or some hedge fund who has acquired your firm, figured out that they can outsource to a company in Bangladesh, let's say, that employs labor, under conditions that are extremely exploitative and unsafe and so forth. You look at this and say, look, how am I being treated? I'm essentially being forced. The only way in which I could have competed in this economy is by accepting working conditions that are similar to those in that country to which the production was outsourced. And yet, sort of, these are, the advanced countries have, are 2 centuries into sort of progress in labor markets and social arrangements and labor rights and quality of work and so forth. And the idea that globalization and outsourcing can be a vehicle through which you can essentially undermine the gains of the welfare state or the New Deal I think, is naturally creates a kind of sense of unfairness, which in turn can be exploited by right-wing politicians and populist demagogues who basically can point to these inadequacies of our existing trade regime to, in fact, blow up the problems of trade into a much worse, much bigger problems than they actually are, and that's effectively what Donald Trump in the United States in the United States did. So, the issue is, again, I think, for a long time, for example, economists, sort of denied the notion of fair trade. They said that was a silly trade. And trade is, comparative advantage. It doesn't matter how comparative advantage is created. If it's created by having, sort of absence of labor unions and therefore labor repression, well, that's comparative advantage too. But that really doesn't make sense. I think that we need to think about sort of you cannot use the world economy to arbitrage as a source of arbitrage and bringing labor and social standards in countries where those were won after very long periods of political fights down. And just like now, we understand that there is a good argument that we have to stop the tax, the race to the bottom in corporate taxation. We need to think that there is a similar argument for thinking about how each nation can uphold its own labor and social standards and supply of good jobs without necessarily completely isolating itself from the world economy, but to ensure that the demands of the local economy, local labor markets come first.
Yeah. Okay, so I hear you say, I mean, many things here, but 2 things stand out. One is this trade-off between fairness and efficiency of trade, and linked to that is, as you were just mentioning, fundamental labor standards. How then do you make trade more inclusive and a means of not only growing the economic pie, but also raising living standards for all. I mean, I think we would all subscribe to that. How do you make it happen, given the inherent difficulties that involves? What you talk about, a smart policy mix, for instance. Can you share with us your thoughts about, what policymakers should be doing to move us into this better, more sustainable, you might argue, global trading system?
I think actually 90% of what has to be done has very little to do about trade policy per se. I think 90% of it is really ensuring that you have, policies that are appropriately targeted at creating good jobs in your economy. And much of that, as I said, 90% of that has nothing to do with trade. It means that you have the appropriate industrial policies, the innovation policies, and yes, also the training policies that ensure that you are able to prop up the sort of the middle of the labor market in terms of medium skilled jobs, which have been essentially the ones that have been disappearing through the industrialization and the forces of globalization. So those good jobs policies are largely domestic policies, and that means essentially rethinking the welfare state, and getting a little bit away from the notion that we simply tax and redistribute through the welfare state, to thinking about the state also having a very active role in providing services, particularly to medium-sized small firms, to ensure that they have the capacity to expand, but also to create good jobs. And the role of trade policy is to ensure that these good jobs policies are not undermined through outsourcing, through the back door, so to speak. So that's where you get into ensuring that there's a global minimum on corporate taxation, that you don't, the race to the bottom in corporate taxation is removed. That's why you need to ensure that there are sort of social anti-dumping policies in the global trade regime, that you can actually, you're able to block imports that come from countries with very poor labor practices that would undermine your labor standards and good jobs policies at home. In the same way that I think countries are entitled to, impose carbon duties for exporters from countries without carbon control policies. But but you don't get the good jobs simply through trade policy. So the best that trade and international tax, international finance policies can do is ensure that your good jobs policies are not being undermined. So that's why I say it's 90% is really a domestic agenda. And I think countries that have failed the worst in terms of providing an appropriate employment picture domestically are those that have where the specter of protectionism has risen the most. I think the U.S. has been is a very good case in point, but you don't have much demand for trade protectionism in Denmark because you don't have the labor market policy, the labor market outcomes to the same extent. Now there are there are still problems there, and you still get the right-wing populism and so forth. But I mean, that's just that these differences do matter in terms of what kind of backlash you get against trade.
So as I hear you, Dani, it's a lot about domestic policies. Trade is not a silver bullet. It can create wealth, but doesn't redistribute it. You need domestic policies to help with that. And I would certainly, for one, agree with much of that. Of course, that touches on some challenging issues for many countries that have different attitudes towards state intervention, government intervention, the role of government, of course. And most clearly in the US. One question that's come up actually is around circular economy, and you touched on this a little bit when you mentioned, I think, carbon border tax. And in the context of what you just mentioned, could these policies around, ESG, particularly from Europe and increasing the US, be used as tools for protectionism means rather than for as backdoor protectionism, rather than for the sort of original purpose they were designed? Is there a danger by going down this route of saying, nation states can have more degrees of freedom to choose what rules they play by, if I hear you right? Is there not a risk that we open the door for more protectionism? And I just give you a couple of examples of current policy tools that might be hijacked into being used as protectionist instruments. Is this a risk, or do you see that as easily circumnavigated?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a question of balance of risks. I think if you had asked me this question back in the 1950s, I would say that probably the balance of risks is now that we have governments are doing too many things just on their own. So let's let them sign a few more trade agreements so that that they can in some sense in their hands. And because the binding constraint is that we have too little trade, I think, pre-pandemic in 2019, I think the problem was that the governments had gone too much in the other direction, that I think they had sort of over glorified and fetishized the role of trade and globalization. And too often they were using international trade agreements or globalization as an excuse for not doing things domestically that they ought to have been doing. Such as we can't increase corporate taxes because then corporations will go away, or we can't invest in increasing our labor standards because then our jobs are going to go away. So I think the balance of risks right now, as I think the backlash has shown, has been very much in the direction of not giving sort of governments the autonomy and the space to think in which, and I should say that it's more the mindset than the rules themselves. Yes, there are some constraints that are imposed by the WTO and by trade agreements that governments have signed, and by the fact that, yes, capital is mobile, so there are limits to how much you can increase your own tax rates. But I think, again, the bulk of it has been in our mindset, is our thinking that the way we need to act is to prioritize international trade and finance and investment, and not the needs of our domestic. And I think that mindset is the one that we need to change. Now, the risks will still be there. I think the only way we can overcome those risks is by thinking about international cooperation and multilateralism in a somewhat different way, which is to say, rather than sort of simply enacting restrictions and common rules, we should have a system where governments are required to explain what they're doing and why. And so to create a mechanism whereby there is the possibility that in the global public space, if you will, that we would be able to discriminate over time, to learn to distinguish between policies that are really called for by genuine domestic requirement and domestic needs, as opposed to policies that are simply imposing harms on other countries for the purpose of beggaring thy neighbor. So I think what we need to think about is to understand that governments will need to respond to their domestic audiences, but to create a requirement that through exchange of rationale, if you will, that we build some common understanding of when it is desirable for countries to do that, when it is not. And that's going to come only when we think about international rulemaking in a different way, rather than simply enacting common regulations, instead enacting a system of explanation and rationale of what is it that countries are doing and why. So that, for example, if you enact a border tax on carbon intensive products, that you have to explain why exactly that is there, and how exactly it is serving a legitimate objective of environmental sustainability and controlling climate change, and it is not simply propping up some firms that are unable to compete at home.
Yeah. And Danny, we have a question here. I mean, we're running close to the end here, but I have two more questions, and this is one of them. Is that to be done within the WTO as it's currently set up, or does this need a radical reformulation of the institution and how global trade is governed?
Yeah, I don't much hold hope for the WTO in the future, and I don't think ultimately the changes that are needed might be folded into a WTO. But I think a lot will have to happen outside the WTO before. So for the immediate future, I just don't see the WTO as an effective institution for making the needed changes happen. I think the needed changes will happen at both sort of very micro level and sort of the very macro level. At the micro level, there is a lot of trade deal making that happens completely outside the WTO, in fact, completely outside the regular trade negotiating machinery of individual nations. These are, very sort of specific regulatory sectoral arrangements that take place when countries, for example, two countries exchange letters on sort of on regulatory standards that will have to be met when one sort of you export, I don't know, spirits from one country to another or some agricultural product to another. All that sort of deal making and trade that happens is completely under the radar screen. But there's a lot of sort of new ways of thinking about how do we render compatible the need for trade with the need for regulatory autonomy and on the part of different countries. So there's a lot of work that is happening at the very micro, very sectoral level. But we need to sort of increase the transparency of that process, because typically it's a bunch of business people who have the stake and maybe a few government bureaucrats. So that's on the one hand, there is that kind of very micro level, very sectoral, in fact, very product based deal making that happens, which will continue to happen, and where there's a lot of action. At the very macro level, I think the US and China will have to reach a kind of a modus vivendi, because that's really the big issue on the global economy. And I think, unfortunately, the Biden administration seems intent on continuing Trump's approach, which I think is very unproductive vis-a-vis China. There are a lot of areas, in fact, that the US and China could be cooperating on, all the while understanding that, in fact, these systems are very different, and and also that there is sort of competition in geopolitical terms, and also significant human rights issues in China that need to be taken into account. But I think by treating China as an all-around geopolitical and economic rival, the U.S. administration is actually making China more into such a rival, because it's forcing also China to respond in kind. So I think at the macro level, there will have to be a kind of a some understanding of what the rules for of peaceful economic coexistence is, and it's only after that understanding can eventually perhaps be folded into a multilateral system, but it'll have to happen bilaterally.
Right. Okay, well, we'll watch out for signs of that in the ministerial meeting at the end of November. Maybe it's a bit of wishful thinking, but I'll certainly keep an eye out for those flags going up. Danny, I think we're close to the end here, but what I'd like to do is just ask you to give us three takeaways, and from the perspective of this, that many of our companies and many customers are running global supply chains that have benefited tremendously from this wave of globalization. What three things should they keep in mind, would you say, as they look forward 5-10 years and thinking about where to place their bets, if you will, in terms of their global footprint, given all of these geopolitical factors impacting how global trade works, and as you've eloquently described the social questions that are beginning to shape policy at the domestic level. What should they keep in mind as they look out across the horizon?
So I think the broadest message is that I don't think we're on the verge of a collapse of the world trading system or anything like that. So we're not going back to the 1930s. So that's in some sense, the good news. The bad news is I don't think, going back to how we started out, I don't think we've all taken on board sufficiently the changes that have been economic, political, and technological changes that have been happening now for some time, and the implications they have for how we approach trade policy in general. And so that might mean that it's still going to be a bumpy ride. That I think the backlash will continue to be with us. I think U.S.-China trade wars will and then sort of will continue. The conflicts will continue. So maybe it's not, if you think about the good, the bad, the ugly scenarios of the future of world trade, it's not the bad. It's not the good in terms of, I don't think we're anywhere near sort of striking the right balance between national autonomy and prerogatives and an open world economy. But it might be the ugly. I mean, the ugly scenario they'll be with there. I think for individual companies and decision makers, I mean, I think the three words I would keep in mind would be resilience, solidarity, and sustainability. So it's really, that it's, what the pandemic has highlighted in particular is the need to have supply chains and economic relationships that are much more resilient and simply, instead of just cost cutting and efficiency and so forth. Solidarity. I mean, I think business people have too often increasingly thought of themselves as essentially being global citizens and part of this world economy. But honestly, being a global citizen is also, often meant being a citizen of nowhere and of not being accountable. I think businesses, especially large, prosperous businesses, will have to act in ways that show much greater solidarity with their local communities, and therefore they'll have to be understanding that there will be demands placed on them by their local communities and the local governments that they have responsibility for contributing to healthy, thriving local economies, and that means first and foremost creating sufficient number of good jobs for the local workers. And finally, of course, sustainability. I mean, climate change remains our greatest existential threat, and that's going to come first, second, and third before any need for trade. And again, that requires understanding, and that's is something to which the business community will have to contribute to positively.
Yeah. Thanks, Dani. I think that's a great way to end on three things: resilience, solidarity, and sustainability. Three things that resonate strongly with Maersk. Dani, let me thank you wholeheartedly for a wonderful discussion, stimulating as ever, thought-provoking as ever. Thank you for your time, Dani. It's been a great session.
My pleasure, Graham. Good to talk.
Thank you to all of those who participated on the call. We'll have another trade talk in the coming months. Thank you again, Dani. Bye for now.
Thank you.